Boa tarde a todos e todas. Estamos na conferência de abertura do professor Tom Ginsburg, da segunda sessão do ICON-S Brasil. O professor Ginsburg vai falar sobre um tema bastante importante a respeito das questões de ameaças à democracia, especialmente do que aconteceu nos Estados Unidos acerca da invasão do Capitólio. A palestra será em inglês e o professor Diego fará a apresentação. It's a pleasure, Professor Ginsburg, to have you here at the ICON-S open session. So, Diego, you can continue.
Thank you, Estefânia, and thank you very much, Professor Ginsburg, for kindly accepting this invitation. I'm going to be very brief so that we can make the most of your time with us. And just want to highlight for people in the audience, especially the younger scholars, that it's such a big honor for the Brazilian chapter of ICON-S to have Professor Ginsburg here, because in his work, he has more than once helped shape and, I would say, reinvent the field of comparative constitutional law in the last 2 or 3 decades. First with his 2003 book on judicial review in new democracies, and then, just to give another example, in his leading role in the Comparative Constitutions project. So I can think of few scholars that embody the comparativistic spirit of ICON-S and the kind of work we strive to do more than Professor Ginsburg. So we are very, very happy to have you here. Professor Ginsburg is Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of Chicago. And without further delay, I'll give the floor to our keynote speaker today. Thank you, Professor Ginsburg.
Thank you, Diego. Thank you, Estefânia. And thanks to everyone for joining. It's an honor for me, actually, to be invited to address what I'm sure must be among the biggest chapters and the most vital chapters of ICON-S, and also just generally in public law. Brazil and the United States actually, I think, are very tightly bound together in recent history. And actually, my topic today is one dimension on which we are bound together. So let me try to share my screen here and successfully do it. So my talk is about disqualification, which I'm calling democracy's other boundary problem. I'll explain this shortly, but it's drawing on joint work I've done with Aziz Haq and David Landau. And in the last year, we were motivated to tackle impeachment processes. And of course, Brazil and the United States were 2 very central cases here in recent years in which impeachment has played a major role in the politics of the country, very controversial and very polarizing, but also a reflection of the underlying polarization of the society. And, I'd say the impeachments were a little bit different. Ours was obviously against a person who was not committed to the democratic process, and it failed. Yours was against Dilma Rousseff, whose, wrongs were relatively minor, I think most people would agree, but she was removed. So that's an interesting dimension. The third person in this picture is the South Korean President Park Geun-hye, who was impeached in 2018, I guess, 17, and she was subsequently sent to jail. And this is a really interesting case because she was impeached for various matters. She was very, very unpopular. And because she was sent to jail, she was no longer able to run for office. And so this is really what led to our concern about disqualification as a separate dimension of the impeachment process. In both Brazil and the United States, after a president is impeached, there's a separate removal process. But then there is a third decision which must be taken. Should that person be disqualified from running for future office? And Dilma was not barred, and in fact, she did, I think, run again for Senate, if I remember. Trump, of course, wasn't even removed, but if he had been, there would have had to been a separate vote, according to our Constitution, where the Senate would decide whether or not to let the person run for office. In the, I think we've had 20-something impeachments, including of several federal judges, only a couple of them have ever been disqualified from running for future office. In one very famous case, there is a federal judge, Alcee Hastings, who was impeached in the 1980s from being a judge because he was corrupt. He was found with $100,000 in his freezer. And so they impeached him. He was removed from office, and he immediately ran for the House of Representatives, and he remains in the House of Representatives today. So he was impeached, removed, but not disqualified. So this is leading us to explore disqualification as a separate mechanism. And of course, in Brazil, I think Collor was disqualified for some period. So we have experience with these two dimensions or two different decisions that must be taken. Now, this is something from our work on impeachment, which shows you the frequency since 1990 of calls for impeachment of a president. That is the top line. Calls for removal, actual removals are relatively rare, and disqualifications are rarer still. They're very, very rare that someone is disqualified from future office holding. I mentioned Collor, who was, I think, set aside for a period. But of these others, Fujimori went to jail, and Paxas was disqualified after the fact. But the others, I think, were all allowed to continue to run for office. And so that's a very interesting question. If someone has attacked the democracy, should they be allowed to participate in the democratic process in the future? That's the core question that we're interested in. Democracy faces a fundamental challenge in that we have to defend ourselves from anti-democratic people, but the remedy of disqualifying someone from running is, as we will show, often ineffective, and itself presents some significant dangers for democracy itself. So this is why we're calling it democracy's other boundary problem. Those of you familiar with political theory know that there's this concept of democracy's boundary problem. And this is the point that in order to determine who can participate in the democratic process, we have to figure out what democracy should ideally include. That is, what is the boundary of the political community? How do we do that using democratic mechanisms? How can a democracy decide democratically who can participate without some ex ante decision as to who's in and who's out in order to participate in that self-democratic process? That's the democracy's boundary problem. And it's about who can vote, basically. What we are focused on is who can participate. And it raises similar difficulties, I guess, of some of the paradoxes, I suppose. Now, the concept of disqualifying someone, removing them from political competition, actually goes back to the ancient Greeks. And this is I don't know how to say it in ancient Greek, but it's the origin of the word ostracism in English, which is the assembly would once a year have a procedure where people could call for an ostracism. And they would write the name of the person that they wanted to exclude from office on the little shard, and then there would be a vote. And so it was often tried, but not often successfully. And this little process has come down to us as a mechanism for somewhat democratic control of who can actually participate, who can run for office and participate. So it's a significant and very old issue that democracies have been dealing with for a long time. Now, in the United States, there was a lot of debate about this 1 year ago, or in January of this year, I guess. It seems so long ago, when after the Capitol riot, there was discussion of what to do about President Trump. And it was pretty clear that the politics would not allow impeachment. So the first way you could get disqualified under the US Constitution is there's an impeachment, a removal of a 2/3 vote, and then a vote to disqualify the person from holding any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. So that, again, has been used 3 times out of 8 total removals out of 20-something impeachments. It's rare. And it was not available with regard to Donald Trump. That led many scholars to look at this other clause of the US Constitution, which people had not paid attention to or hadn't paid much attention to for 150 years. And that is Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which states that no person shall hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state which has engaged in an insurrection or rebellion or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. So in other words, if you committed insurrection or rebellion, you couldn't hold a US government office or a state office. This was passed obviously in the Reconstruction period. And the idea was to, I guess we would now call this lustration, right? Lustration, which is the term that's used in many post-communist countries to symbolize or to capture the idea that you're just going to ban officials of the former regime as sort of enemies of the new regime. In 150 years ago, this was a promising mechanism to keep Confederates out of office, but in fact was rarely used. There's a couple of judges who were purged in Tennessee, but basically the courts held that Congress had to pass a statute to use this mechanism. And that, in other words, that the 14th Amendment itself was not sort of self-executing or self-enforcing. And without that statute, it wasn't available. And so this meant that it wasn't really used. But like many parts of the Constitution, it's just sitting there. And so when Trump committed his crimes against democracy, in my opinion, this was something people looked to. Maybe we could use this. The problem still is that the mechanism didn't have an enforcement machine, so it didn't really. So that's not really available. Another way you could be disqualified, of course, is not from failure or attacking democracy, but from being too successful. If you win the presidency twice, a term limit is a kind of a disqualification. And so that's a very different form, but it has the same effect. You no longer can participate in the political competition. We also have occasionally had houses of Congress expel members, but that mechanism also is very, very. So disqualification has a thin and kind of strange architecture in the United States. When we look at other countries, we might learn something, I guess, from their experience. And, lustration I've already mentioned, but in the aftermath of the Orange Revolution in the Ukraine this last decade, there was a law passed which banned anyone who had worked for the prior president, including the prior president, from running for political office or serving in government. It's a pretty major group of 2,800 people. In some of the post-communist cases, it was 14,000, 15,000 people who were banned permanently from office. So lustration is another mechanism. Another way to be disqualified is by being a member of a party. So in 2014 in South Korea, very interesting case, where under President Park, who I just referred to before, she went after a very small pro-North Korean party. Kind of interesting that someone would have a pro-North Korean party in South Korea, but they did. And they had 5 MPs in the National Assembly. Now, there wasn't much threat that this tiny party was going to take over South Korea, but using the provisions of militant democracy, right, using the classic mechanisms adopted after World War II in Germany, the court was able to ban the party as being against, Republican principles and undermining the security and integrity of the state. And so that meant that 5 sitting MPs lost their seats. And that's another mechanism one could imagine. We don't have it in the United States, of course, but it is something, it's another way to disqualify. And finally, in Lithuania, after Paksas was impeached, he decided to run again. He was still pretty popular. And there was nothing in the Constitution which said that you couldn't run again after you were impeached. And so they passed a special law to keep him out. So that's another of the rare cases in which removal is voted. Okay, so putting all these together, one can come up with a comparative typology. And we have two dimensions here. First of all, is the mechanism of exclusion backward-looking or forward-looking? That is it focused on some bad action that the person or their party has engaged in? Or is it more forward-looking? Is it focused on something, the future of democratic competition? And then another dimension is whether or not it is operating at the level of the individual bad actor, Mrs. Puck or something like that, or is it operating at the level of the group? Is it directed at, for example, an entire party? So putting these two things together, we come up with this typology, which is a core aspect of our paper and framework. So starting in the upper left, you have group-oriented disqualification that is backward-looking. It's because of something the group did in the past. And that's what lustration is. The banning of the Ba'ath Party in Iraq, the Ukraine party ban that I mentioned. But you also can have forward-looking group mechanisms. And this is what I think these party bans fall into this box, where you have a situation where you're worried not about the thing the party has said or done in the past, but about their potential taking over in the future. How can an undemocratic party be allowed to compete in a democracy? That seems fundamentally flawed. And so that's a forward-looking mechanism. We want to prevent them from being too successful, not worried about what they did in the past. At the individual level, we also have this distinction between backward-looking and forward. So all those impeachment kind of mechanisms are really about bad action, something you did in the past. In the United States, we have a lot of rules which disqualify felons, people who committed crimes, from voting. Sometimes in some states, permanent bans. You're excluded from the political community forever if you committed some felony and served time. So that's obviously a punishment for some bad actions backward. On the other hand, we also have these forward-looking mechanisms, term limits. I guess I'd say retirement ages are in there too, maybe. I mean, not sure, but I guess you'd think of retirement ages as excluding someone because you think that the future would be harmed if they were to continue to serve, that their capacities might be diminished. So this is kind of a framework. And then what we do is we go through, and I'll stop sharing, and think really seriously about how to handle this central problem. So the first thing I want to mention is that designing disqualification is really tricky. We have to design these democratic mechanisms in ways that advance our goals of self-government without facilitating their abuse in the hands of the current power holders who might seek to entrench themselves. Obviously, if you just allow, sitting power holders to exclude specific individuals, that's going to be very problematic for democracy. But if you don't do anything about that, then you have, I guess, what I would call the Trump problem. Someone who is not at all committed to democracy being able to run again and perhaps attack it, even threatening its basic existence. The other thing I would say is that these mechanisms are a little bit distinct from other things about who can participate in the process, because those are, generally speaking, ex ante. So, this isn't about criminal punishment. It's not about, excluding non-citizens or minors or something like that from public office. This is really about disqualification, for the sake of democracy itself. Okay, so let me just say now, thinking about these various actors, as I guess my discussion has suggested, that it's really a matter of optimization, right? You don't want too much disqualification that's too easy, but you don't want it to be too difficult either. It's the Goldilocks problem of constitutional design, as we'd say in English. Goldilocks, I don't know if the story translates, but you get the idea. You want some middle path. So let's consider some examples of how things might go too far, how you can run risks in both directions. In terms of lustration, I think a very good example of a failure was the American disbanding of the Ba'ath Party in Iraq. Anyone who had been a member of the Ba'ath Party could not run for office in Iraq. And that was really bad because it turns out the entire, elite of Iraqi society had joined the Ba'ath Party, often for instrumental reasons, not ideological ones. And so you turned all of the most talented and most well-armed people in this society into enemies. And that obviously is one of the dumbest decisions in the entire history of American empire. So that seems, it could be too broad in other words. Now, on the other hand, in the case of the Confederates in the United States, it really was not used at all. And who knows, maybe that might have saved or extended the period of Reconstruction had we been more serious about punishing the Confederate rebels against the United States. So those are kind of risks of over and under inclusion. Let's move to party bans, which is, of course, a way of excluding wholesale, in a forward-looking way, whole groups. 29% of all constitutions have these possibilities of banning a political party for undemocratic political programs that they want to advance. And I guess our assessment of that is that it really does bring up some dangers. We think that South Korean story I told before is not particularly compelling. It was a minor party. It was not going to take over. Let them sit there in parliament. There's no reason to ban them. It may be in more extreme cases, when the party is actually a threat to take over, is when it's even more disturbing. So, for example, and I'm thinking of cases where it is deeply abused. So in Cambodia, the prime minister, which is not a democracy, the prime minister used militant democracy provisions in the constitution to ban his only opposition party. In Thailand, military parties and military leaders, through the Constitutional Court, repeatedly banned the political parties associated with the populist Thaksin Shinawatra. And he remained popular. So it didn't really work very well, right? Those of you familiar with Turkey can sort of sense a similar story. The Erdogan and his predecessor, Abdullah Gül, in what became the AKP, these were Islamist parties that kept getting banned by the Constitutional Court, and they kept coming back because there was a demand in the polity for an Islamist party. And so that shows you that it can be abused and also ineffective. In fact, when we look at the literature, Aziz Haq and I, in our book on how to save a constitutional democracy, we're very skeptical of party bans. They seem to be totally a crude mechanism. They do have some uses, and maybe the canonical story of when they're useful is the German cases from the 1950s, when they banned the Nazi Party for obvious reasons, and a year later, the Communist Party. And, I guess we can understand that early in a democracy's life, it's really important to keep anti-democratic parties from running for office. But at some point, you have to trust the people, basically, because the risk of banning, the risk of using this tool is that it really does invite abuse and it's not really subject to clean principles. If a party is truly popular, you're not really going to keep them down. The third box in our typology was individual backward-looking mechanisms. And here we focus on, I think, what we think is the importance of legislative involvement here. One example of this individual level backward disqualification is found in Israel. So in Israel, the judges have created a doctrine that you have to have a good character in order to run for a public office. And this came up actually in the late years of Benjamin Netanyahu, when they were repeatedly investigating him for bad things he'd done. And there was a big decision about whether the prosecutor would indict him. Because according to this doctrine, once you are indicted, not even convicted, Just merely being indicted, that's a sign of bad character, and you're not allowed to run for office. This is a judicially created doctrine with no textual foundation, which really, to me, suggests, that non-democratic actors have taken over the policing of democracy, but maybe excessively so. If the public wanted to vote for Netanyahu, as they repeatedly did for a long time, they should be allowed to do so, notwithstanding judicial determinations of really very, very, very minor accusations of corruption, very minor compared to what we experience in the United States or you in Brazil. So I think the takeaway there is that we think legislatures are better. In other words, leave it to the democratic process if you're going to have individual level disqualification. And finally, we had term limits. And of course, there's a large literature on term limits. I've written on them myself. But I think one of the themes of that literature is that they are quite easily evadable, right? If someone really is popular, it is hard to keep them down if they insist on it. I think in my study, and Mila Versteeg, who sort of did a similar study some years later, 25% of all leaders try to extend their term, of all presidential leaders, and they're very successful. In my study, it was 80% of those are successful. So they're evadable, but if someone's really popular, they're evadable. But, if working well in a democracy, they still can have an effect. So we're certainly in favor of term limits, but as a mechanism of disqualification, it can be a little bit imperfect. And I think this is, again, a kind of theme that we see. It's really hard to keep people out when they are popular. That's the problem. And precisely when they're not popular is when these mechanisms are not needed very much, right? A party ban against a tiny party in South Korea really isn't very important in terms of saving the democracy. They were not going to win anyway. But trying to ban a party that had won every tie election since 2000, which they really did win every single election, every time the Constitutional Court would ban them, that's been very disruptive and actually destructive of democracy, maybe even more destructive than the populist regime of Thaksin would have produced. That's one theme in terms of our analysis. We also think that temporary bans are better than permanent bans. Collor was temporarily banned. He never came back into politics. Many of the other presidents who were impeached and removed hung around in politics, but none of them ever returned to office. So you could be impeached, removed, not disqualified, and then you're the main opposition figure. And usually that means you're going to suffer a political cost for having been impeached and removed. And that seems to be the case with all of those figures. Lugo and Paraguay, certainly Zafi in Madagascar. I could go down the list again. So temporary bans seem to be better if you're going to do it. Permanent bans seem silly, and maybe no ban at all is a good. We also think that the individual level mechanisms are cleaner and easier, maybe better than the group level ones. So the group level ones are lustration and party bans. They seem to be highly problematic in many, many cases, even if they sometimes have some efficacy. In any case, if you are going to use a group mechanism, make it temporary. Allow people to return to the democratic fold. We also think that clarity in the rule is really, really important. So let's take a rule that bans felons from running for the presidency. That's an example of a disqualification rule in some sense. And, that's very, very clear. It's absolutely bright line. It's not something fuzzy like the Brazil impeachment standard or, high crimes and misdemeanors, an extremely fuzzy standard. I think that the clearer the rule, then there's less risk of abuse of disqualification by incumbents, which are trying to, preserve their own power. Finally, we conclude by coming back to the United States, because that is, of course, the major concern for Aziz and David and I, and return to this issue of insurrection. It's really the Trump problem. Trump may run again, and depending on who runs against him, he might even have a chance of winning. I don't really think so, but he might. And so that leads to the question, well, what could we do about someone who actually starts a riot and seeks to overthrow the constitutional order? And I know there's dispute about how much Trump knew and what he wanted, but let's just, for the sake of argument, say that he was, neglectful in failing to stop a riot in which police officers were targeted and beaten, and in an attempt to block the orderly progression of presidential succession. Now, what could we do? Well, one thing is that we could actually pass a statute to enforce Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. It's right now there's no mechanism of enforcement, so we actually could do that. A statute for insurrection would be a very valuable thing because it would allow us to disqualify in a way that was not tied to the heat of the moment, right? And maybe that's the big theme, I guess I should conclude with, that thinking about disqualification systematically is important because it allows us to solve democracy's boundary problem without thinking about specific cases. We don't want people running for office who attack the democracy. They should be excluded, and the Constitution should allow that. On the other hand, I think there is genuine risk of abuse, of being overly broad, because remember that all of these rules are going to be implemented by humans who are in governmental office in some form or another, judges or legislatures or executives, and themselves may be implicated. So that's always the trick with constitutional design. Optimization is always the name of it. So that's about as much as I think I want to say, but I'd be very interested to hear your questions and comments and see what you think about whether disqualification as a category is a useful way of thinking about democracy and constitutional preservation. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Professor Ginsburg. I'll begin with a couple questions, and we already have at least a couple more questions. And so my first question would be this, that looking at the typology and considering some things that you said after you presented it, I wonder if there is an implicit extra dimension, a third dimension, that is connected to the institution that is applying this sanction, right? You at some point you normatively distinguish between the appropriateness of certain measures being taken by a judicial body or a legislative body. So I wonder if that shouldn't be somehow built into the category, because it seems to me that it has normative implications. And another point would be that so two quick points. One, you compare these different mechanisms by saying that they are better, and to me, more specifically, that sometimes ends up being saying that they are more effective, that they have better effect. So I was just wondering if you're thinking of incorporating other normative standards in this comparison, especially in cases where I feel that there is not much to be said in terms of the dangers for democracy of disqualifying a single individual, for example. Yes, it could happen, but I feel that maybe most of the action would be happening on different normative grounds, like this is unfair, this is not a principled and enough justification for such measures. So when you're talking about the wholesale measures, I think it's very persuasive, but I was wondering whether you would need more different normative standards to discuss the individual, not the wholesale possibilities of exclusion. And then just a mini follow-up point is this: would you feel at this point in this research that the individual backward-looking exclusionary disqualification measure taken by a legislative body, would you feel it's a problem? Where is this project taking you in terms of how you would assess this specific cell? Would you feel that it's a problem, and then what makes you think that this is a problem, if it's dangerous or if it's another normative consideration? Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Very helpful. Yeah, I mean, there's different 3 or 4 other dimensions we could think about. The institution is a really good one, and you're absolutely right about that. Permanence, how long should the term of disqualification be? You might think actually logically about cycles. How many elections do you have to sit out would be one way to think about that. So I think that's right. And then the other thing is, what's the scope of a disqualification in terms of like what we called in the impeachment paper, predicate action? What do you have to do? How high should that standard be? With regard to impeachment, I tend to favor a lower standard, something like the Brazil one. I think it was abused personally in the last case, but some presidential constitutions allow the president to be impeached for behavior unbecoming of the office. And I don't think that's necessarily bad. It sort of turns the presidential system a little bit more to a parliamentary one. When someone's really unpopular, they could be excluded. So that's the question of scope. So those are at least 3 other dimensions, right, that one could add to the framework. And so, a 2x2 box is a lot easier than a 2x2 by 2x2, several dimensions. But I absolutely take your point that a little more specification about those things would be useful, a little more systematic analysis. So that's very helpful. What's wrong with the individual backward-looking disqualification? I mean, I think I agree with you in the sense that we favor individual disqualification over group. In some sense, you might say individual disqualification. First of all, the two things are somewhat related, right? One reason I think that we have term limits is because we want to incentivize political actors to think in terms of parties rather than personalities, right? If you know that there's a term limit, then you as leader are incentivized to find a good successor and to cultivate other people in the party and have rotation and allow us parties to play their function of genuine, sort of policy-based groups of people who persist over time. It's very essential for democracy. So in that sense, the term limit is constitutive of healthy group political behavior. With regard to individual level disqualification, I think it may be the same, right? If you have an individual legislator who does something wrong and gets disqualified permanently, let's say, it's a signal to the others in the same political grouping of how to behave. And it doesn't cut too badly, So I think that's maybe the ideal cell, if you will, and the ideal mechanism. I worry a little bit about courts because in general, I think, the judicialization of politics has, gone pretty far in a lot of countries. In my country in particular, with our lifetime appointments and these demigods who rule us, it's really out of control. So I guess I've always been a little skeptical about handing new things to judges, but I think this may be one area where self-policing is possible, particularly if you're talking about individual level mechanisms rather than group ones. With group ones, I think it's a little bit more dangerous, precisely because the self-policing might not happen. The group with power will be most tempted to use exclusion and party bans against their main, political threats, which are by definition maybe the second most popular party. So that's why I think that's a little bit problematic. But in any case, long-winded answer to your excellent question, and thank you for it. I'll try to straighten things out a little bit in the next version of this draft.
Professor Ginsburg, thank you for your lecture. I have a quick question concerning the normative implications of those mechanisms. I kept thinking that constitutions have several provisions that limit rights for the sake of democracy. So for instance, I don't know, rules that state requirements to vote or to run for office. Those rules limit rights, but they organize democracy. So I kept thinking, why would be disqualification different? Why would it be normatively a problem? And yeah, you said in the previous answer that they create election rules, create incentives for a healthy democracy, but then this would be the measure to draw this line, or what would be this measure? So thank you again for the lecture.
Yeah, well, that's great. Tough question. I think that, to me, the limitations on rights to protect democracy are a little bit different in the sense that there is political competition is itself such an important mechanism for the protection of rights, right? Democracy depends obviously on turnover across parties and rotation in office, and so that it becomes a problem for the whole of democracy. The abuse of these things, maybe more so than just an ordinary level, rights violation in some sense. But I think they maybe are species of the same thing in the sense that they are bounding, arguably, political competition. I mean, another mechanism of militant democracy is obviously hate speech provisions and things like this. So those are related, right? But I'm just sort of focused on this one consequence, to be permanently removed from running for office. That's just the narrow lens of this particular project, which obviously is related to these other things from which there are some small literatures. So, it's an unusual paper, right? We're putting together things which are not normally put together, but they do have this one thing in common. And maybe we can say something interesting across those four boxes because of that juxtaposition. That's basically the method here.
Professor, I don't know if we have time, Diego, and other questions, but we are thinking in Brazil, we are watching the insurrection in slow motion. Like we know the attacks of Bolsonaro to the electoral process. And the problem is that we have the Supremo Tribunal Federal, the Supreme Court, and also the electoral court. And they are trying to create some precedents to disqualify him if he attacks again the democracy. But the problem, I think, it's about the presidential system. We think about a candidate of re-election of a president that have good faith in respecting the process. But in case of bad faith, actually, he is president. He's not just a candidate. And the political onus is very high to a tribunal, a court, disqualificate him, because it's not just a juridical protection, but also a political one. So what you said about the judicialization of politics, it's a problem. Here in Brazil, it's a higher problem because everything is judicialized.
Yeah, believe me, we've been there, right? We just went through this emotional experience of the last year or two, and it's been obviously extremely disturbing. Our backsliding also went much faster than we thought, right? So Huck and I wrote this book in 2018, and by 2020, they were trying to overturn the election. It's incredible, much faster than I thought. So that's the risk in Brazil, and I understand you must be very anxious about it. But if we step back from the current moment and think about how would we design something like this? In Israel, very interestingly, if the Supreme Court had, decided that Netanyahu was, corrupt or something, he would have lost office. Now, the threshold there, maybe, I was arguing against that mechanism, but partly it's because the threshold was really pretty low. It's just they are deciding he has bad character. Maybe we need a stronger law of democracy. Maybe we all need to address this problem head on with, a set of specifically designed, violations attacking the electoral process or something like that. In a very extreme way, or trying to overthrow the mechanism of presidential succession or something like that, for which, there's criminal penalties and, disqualification that's attached to it. Basically, we're doing this all in a kind of second order way because we never imagined that these kind of characters would emerge in our democracies. In 1988, they weren't thinking about this problem. And now we see, well, maybe we were naive, but it's not too late. We still can, figure out how to write these statutes and which institutions. Maybe the Electoral Tribunal is exactly the right institution that you can't participate in the campaign if you, in their judgment, have no intention of acknowledging the result. That would be a pretty easy standard to administer. And Trump would have violated. He said the election was rigged before it was even held. So maybe something like that could be something we demanded. I wonder if there's more to do with oaths also. This is kind of a funny thing, but when you take an oath for office, you vow to uphold the Constitution and such. And, are those things consequential? I know Sanford Levinson has been thinking a lot about this, like, do they matter? Do they make a difference? And well, one thing about them is that they do provide a kind of, perjury kind of standard if you then seek to undermine the Constitution. So we could, again, attach some sanctions to the violation of oaths. But it requires legislative action, I think. It's a good project for you young scholars out there in Brazil and around the world.
Professor Ginsburg, I feel like, I don't know how much you address this or it's a concern for you, but I feel like there is a tension here between a value-oriented normative view on the issue and a institutional, cause and consequences effects of certain designs, and they not necessarily lead to the same direction, right? So I feel like the point you're putting here, in comparison, could have a similar point for presidentialism, right? A lot of the criticism for presidentialism in itself is that it has in itself the seeds of crisis, right? The fact that Congress and the president are elected separately allows in the design itself that you're going to have stalemate, and stalemate can be dangerous. So a lot of the criticism, against presidentialism in Latin America, Juan Lins, all that thing has to do with that, right? But there is an argument for presidentialism that is normative, has to do with the fact that people think that it actually allows for someone to be elected, as having majoritarian support, as being truly democratic, or even like the fact that on the one side you have the stalemate, on the other side you have a Congress and a president elected separately, and if they agree, there's even more legitimacy to the system. It seems to me that when it comes to disqualification, there's a similar point. Like at one point you could say that it's dangerous, can lead to crisis. Removing this person that is popular, this is going to lead to a breakthrough. Now you shouldn't do that, right? Even in a very pragmatic point. Some people might even think like, oh, it's better for Bolsonaro to lose the election than for him to be impeached, and because he was going to be able to mobilize around that issue or something like that. That's a type of preoccupation. But there's a value-driven preoccupation also that is on both sides. So I feel like there's a tension here, like a Republican kind of argument that says, well, this is a community of people that are committed to certain core values. Has to do with the oath point that you're making before. And if you have shown that you're not committed to these values, you're not a member of our community anymore, you shouldn't be. So this is kind of a Republican value. On the other, I feel like there's this democratic kind of line that will say the opposite. It will say there's nothing more subversive than someone who was found guilty by an institution, and the people come and by electing them, there's almost like an overruling of the judicial decision. Like if someone was found guilty, but then the people go and elect that person again, they're saying that there was a problem with that person being found guilty to begin with. You could be argued that. So again, to make this more of a question than a comment, to what degree those kind of tensions between a value-oriented analysis of the issue and a design, consequential, pragmatic, normative judgment of the issue plays a role for you?
It's a great question, great comment, actually. So I just want to put quotes around what you said and said yes. But basically, I do think that they do go together in my own mind. And maybe I'm wrong about this, but I tend to think that values have to be informed by causes and consequences, and vice versa, that they're interrelated. If you want to advance a certain set of values, norms, we pull them out of air and we say we want to advance this. Well, you have to have some sense of how in the real world does that operate? How can you actually instantiate that in the world, which requires some sense of institutions. On the other hand, to just think about, the positivist question of, causes and consequences, obviously you need some values at the end, but it's also the case, and this is my gut feeling response when you were talking, that the Republican values, as you put it, have institutional consequences, right? That is, we want to communicate that we are a community of Democrats, that there's certain lines you can't go outside. And when we do that, that will shape the kind of actors who arise in our system. It's precisely because we've been so open, because we have so much trust in the people, if you will, not to make bad decisions, that we've left ourselves open to demagogues and anti-democrats. And that's just the phase we're in. So, but how do we respond to that? Obviously, reinforcing Republican values is good, but we better have some institutions too, because there are a lot of people now playing in the political field who don't have Republican values. I guess I see those things as going together, but that's just my own way of thinking about it. I may not, certainly don't have the last word on that question.
We have 5 more minutes. I have one quick question, perhaps. And so I was thinking about the pathways of disqualification in Brazil, and what you mentioned about the Israeli case, it almost happened in Brazil around 15 years ago. Some judges tried to reject some attempts by politicians who had been criminally convicted in the past to run for elections, and the Supreme Court said that judges couldn't do that without a law, specific law saying that they could be disqualified from office, and this law currently exists. So what we have in Brazil, I was thinking it's not totally comparable to the other examples you described, because it's so widespread. In Brazil, if you're convicted by a long list of potential crimes, as an immediate effect, you cannot run for office for 8 years, right? It's the clean slate law. And it's interesting, an interesting example made me think of the institutional dimension as well, because it's kind of a combination between the legislative and the judicial actions, right? The judge does not decide that you're disqualified for office. The judge convicts you for a crime, but the legislature has decided that if you are convicted for certain crimes, then as an effect of the conviction, you cannot run for office for 8 years in this case. So I don't know, it's just an interesting mechanism that kind of does not neatly map on the other examples used, and it made me think that the perhaps trying to justify these things as mechanisms to prevent threats to democracy maybe does not do justice to the full array of justifications that we can have, because in Brazil I don't think we would justify the clean slate law in terms of what it does to protect democracy from serious danger. It's more like some people are unfit for public office, which you could develop in the way of it's going to be a threat to democracy, but it's not the most immediate justification. So I'm just going to throw this there, and maybe it's useful for the future paper.
Yeah, but it reminds me that we have the similar thing in the States, which is, of course, you can't, this felon disenfranchisement. So you're convicted of an ordinary crime, theft or something like that, and then you get thrown in jail, then you do your time, and then you find you can't vote. But it also means, I think, in most cases, you also can't run for office. You can't join the bar. There's hundreds of things you can't do once you're convicted of a crime in the States. And I think what you said is basically the motivation. We're a Protestant country, so we think people are either good or bad, and if you're one of the bad types, well, we just don't want you around, and you're not really a full member of the political community. Now, obviously, it's extremely problematic from like a criminal law theory. It's all this excessive punishment that gets put on you. It's administered in horribly racist ways and racially biased ways. But at the core, I think there is some similar thing to what you described, which is we want clean politics. You've shown that you're dirty in this one little tiny dimension, and so you can't join. But, the problem, of course, is the politics aren't particularly clean, even with that. We need much better mechanisms if that's what we're trying to get at. So in any case, I do think that that set of mechanisms is relevant and should think about as well as as we revise this framework.
If I can add a tiny point, is just, so if you're considering that, I would also considering limitations that have to do with being in the army, which are, I believe, they exist in a lot of places for, again, for pragmatic reasons, because of the army and the coups and all of that, but also there is this idea which has to do with, and I think that it's similar for felons, right? Part of it has to do with the moral value. You're not fit to be a part of this, but part of it is pragmatic. You're not truly free. Someone who is not free should not vote because they're not going to vote freely. There's this idea also. Again, to what degree this is true, it's relevant here, but it would actually be similar. Someone who is in the army is not truly free, lives under a lot of constraints and is hierarchy and all of that in a very similar way to someone, especially for like in the army by, as someone who was mandatorily is in the army, that kind of situation. So I'll just put that out there to think the pragmatic reasons, especially in Latin America, but not only with, military coups and all that fear of military participating in politics by voting or being voted, but also specifically this idea that it's not about qualification and not being fit, but has to do with not being truly free. And therefore, the vote should be a manifestation of someone who has free will in a more specific way.
I mean, I think that connection is right, but I also think what you said about the protection of democracy is the more directly relevant point for this paper. So if you're disqualified from running for office, if you're an active duty military person, I don't think you can run for president. That's the case. That is a kind of democracy protecting exclusion, which is different in kind than saying you have to be 18 or, you can't be senile. It really goes to the systemic quality of democracy that we're worried that if you get elected, you will end democracy. And so in that sense, it has a lot in common with these disqualifications. So thank you, that's a really good addition. I do want to bracket those other kinds of exclusions from participation about being a minor or, someone who's lost capacity, because I feel like those have very different rationales, which more have to do with, are you going to be able to fulfill your role in the democracy rather than you're a threat? Because all of these other things are you're a threat in some sense. And by the way, I guess I know time is closed out, but I should make quite clear why term limits are addressed to a future threat. The threat is that you will keep running and you will be a threat to democracy because you're so good and so popular. You will crowd out other successors. You will prevent parties from really being vigorous. And so in some sense, with a term limit, we are trying to structure political competition in a way that's healthy for the long term.
Hi, Tom, everyone.
Hey.
Just a very short question. I think one point that might be interesting, because of course we are discussing how this qualification or these other laws or rules which are connected to this perhaps paternalist perspective of protecting, I don't know, the political environment, a clean political environment, and so on. How maybe there might be a correlation between a culture of discredit of Congress and politics with this kind of laws, and whether, for example, qualification relates somehow to I don't know, a cultural mindset that might play a role here. So we impeach someone and we qualify because, of course, this is a consequence. It's a political consequence, but at the same time, it's just like we don't believe that much in politics in a way. And I don't know if there's kind of a correlation. I don't know if there's whether this country historically has very low levels of belief in the political system, or whether the political environment is actually very discredited in that country. I think in our case, for example, in Brazil, also this, I forgot how to say this in English, Diego, it's a clean act to act, I don't know the word. And also this, the qualification in Brazil is actually a normal mechanism. There was a case in which Dilma Rousseff, they kind of a bargain, there's a bargain afterwards, and so in the end she could run for the Senate, but it's actually an automatic punishment in a way. But I don't know if there's a correlation with our cultural, our disbelief in the political system in a way. It's just a point.
As you know, I generally try to avoid cultural explanations. And I think we can get pretty far in this case with just kind of a rationalist, bargaining framework. You have parties and they bargain back and forth. And in some countries, bargaining has broken down pretty quickly. And Brazil is one of those. You have so many impeachment proposals. And when you have an impeachment proposal, that's a sign that you're not trying to talk to the other side. And there are other countries, Ukraine. When we counted impeachments, I think it was Ukraine, Nigeria, and Brazil had the most number. And in other countries, it just doesn't happen because the bargaining is more effective in some sense. Now, removal is the highest escalation. Like, not only have you been, not removal, but disqualification. Future disqualification is a very high level. That's like the equivalent of being banished from the group in the primitive situation. It's political death. And that's a very high escalation. And usually they don't have to go that far because they've gotten everything they need by removing the person from office. Let them have their pride. Let them keep running. And in some sense, it might even be good for us if the loser impeached person gets to keep running. So I think that kind of framework gets us a little further. But it does raise the question of how you get out of a situation like you're in with this high escalation, high polarization. And if you figure that out, let me know so we can apply it here in the United States.
Thank you very much once again, Professor Ginsburg. It's a great opportunity to see a major work in progress, and we are all thankful for your presentation. And I would like to thank also Professor Juliano Benvindo, who is also a member of ICON-S Brasil's board, and Tomás Pereira, also a member of the board. And yes, I guess our time is up. Thank you very much, Professor Ginsburg. And I guess that's it. Am I forgetting something? I don't think so. So thank you, Tom.
We'll continue with the parallel panels, and this is going to be available on YouTube for the ones following us on YouTube. It's going to be permanently there. That's the only two.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.